They started with a tomato plant on an apartment patio in Massachusetts. No land, no skills, no plan beyond a feeling that the life they were living wasn't the life they were supposed to have. That couple is Dennis and Amy Westerlind, and in the space of about 15 years, they went from a cramped New England suburb to one of the most remote, legally designated wilderness subsistence zones in the entire United States. The story of how they got there, and what Dennis has now confirmed about what comes next, is the reason people keep watching Holdfast Alaska. Before there was a homestead, before there was a YouTube channel with hundreds of thousands of subscribers, there was a small apartment in eastern Massachusetts, a lobster boat, and a woman growing tomatoes in a pot by the window. Dennis Westerlind wasn't farming land back then. He was working the water, running lobster traps for his father-in-law's fishing company. Amy worked the same company as secretary. They were young, they were suburban. Neither of them had grown up on a farm, in the woods, or anywhere close to the kind of life they would eventually build. Both had come up in densely populated New England towns, and by any conventional measure, they were on a normal track. Steady jobs, an apartment, a future that looked like most futures, predictable, structured, and comfortable. But somewhere inside both of them, something didn't fit. Amy started growing tomatoes on their small patio, not because she had to, but because she needed to feel like she was producing something. That small pot of soil was the beginning of a much larger obsession. They started reading, they started asking questions. The more they learned about off-grid living, subsistence homesteading, and building a life from scratch, the less satisfied they became with what they already had. The dream they were circling wasn't vague, it was specific. They wanted land. They wanted to grow their own food, harvest their own water, and live by the work of their hands. And increasingly, they wanted to do it somewhere that was genuinely wild, not the manicured, fenced-in version of rural life that exists across much of New England. They made a decision that their families did not understand. They saved every dollar they could and bought some overgrown, rundown acreage in western Maine. The property wasn't much to look at, but it was theirs. And in March 2011, against the direct advice of nearly everyone around them, Dennis and Amy left their apartment behind and moved onto the land. What happened next is the reason this story spread across the internet. They moved onto that Maine property with no cabin, no infrastructure, and no real experience doing any of the things they just committed to doing. Spring came first, then summer. They lived in a tent, cooking over open fire, bathing using water from a freshwater spring on the property. Everything they needed, they either built or went without. There was no internet connection, no electricity, no running water. What they had was each other, a piece of raw land, and a work ethic that neither of them had known they possessed until they were forced to. The cabin came first, small, built by their own hands, room by room, then a well, then cleared acres where there had been nothing but tangled growth. Animals arrived, farm animals they had to learn to raise because they had no prior experience with any of it. Amy threw herself into herbalism, learning to identify, forage, and use wild plants for medicine and preservation. Dennis farmed and took on whatever work the land or the surrounding area demanded. Neither of them had training for most of what they were doing. They learned by trial, by failure, and by refusing to quit. Over 8 years, they transformed that mountainside into a functioning off-grid homestead. A property that had once been nothing became something genuinely impressive. And then, in 2019, their daughter Lena arrived, born at home, in the cabin they had built with their own hands. Amy delivered her there, in the structure they had raised from bare ground. Dennis would later describe the entire main chapter as a labor of love. Every inch of it was built by hand and paid for out of pocket. No loans, no shortcuts, just time and work. And yet somehow, by the end of it, both of them knew they weren't done yet. The Maine homestead had taught them an enormous amount, but it had also shown them something they hadn't expected to feel. They wanted more of a challenge. They wanted wilder. And that's when the decision was made, the one nobody around them saw coming. No. The night they loaded their car onto the ferry at Bellingham, Washington. It was November 2020. Cold, dark, and late. They had spent days driving 3,200 miles across the country from Maine. Dennis, Amy, and their daughter Lena, just over a year old, in the back seat. What waited for them on the other side of that water crossing was not a known place. Dennis and Amy had never visited Alaska before the day they moved there. The decision to go was built entirely on research, on intention, and on a shared conviction that the life they wanted existed there rather than anywhere they'd already been. The crossing itself was not gentle. 36-foot seas on a 5-day voyage through the northern Pacific. Dennis had worked on fishing boats. He knew choppy water. He said later that this was something categorically different. The kind of weather that makes you question whether you've done something irreversible and slightly insane. But they stayed on the boat, and when it docked, they drove off onto Alaskan soil for the first time in their lives. Their first stop was a 2-acre homestead near the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge. They spent several years there, learning coastal Alaska, fishing for salmon, hunting moose on the banks of the Kenai River, figuring out the rhythms of life in a place that operated by entirely different rules than Maine. They were growing, but it still wasn't quite right. Dennis called the Kenai Peninsula a watered-down version of what they were actually looking for. Too crowded, too familiar, too much, he said, like Maine. That description is important because it tells you something specific about what the Westerlinds were chasing. They weren't just looking for a nice piece of land. They were looking for the outer edge, the place where most people stop and they wouldn't have to. Most people who know this story stop here. But the real story starts right now. In spring 2024, Dennis and Amy made their most significant move yet. They had found a small, off-grid log cabin sitting on 7 acres of land near the northern entrance of Wrangell St. Elias National Park. They paid cash, no mortgage, no financing. They packed up everything they owned, left the Kenai Peninsula behind, and drove deep into the eastern Alaskan interior, to a place called Slana, a remote community that most Americans have never heard of. Wrangell St. Elias is not a casual destination. It is the largest national park in the United States, bigger than the entire country of Switzerland. The wilderness around Slana is genuine, working frontier. It is the kind of place where supply runs to the nearest city, take the better part of a day each way, where cell service is a memory, and where the land around you is largely unchanged from what it was 200 years ago. But what drew Dennis to this specific location, what he has talked about directly in his own words, was something that most people watching homesteading content have never thought about: the subsistence zone. When the Westerlinds lived on the Kenai Peninsula, federal and state regulations allowed them to dip net and keep 45 sockeye salmon per year for their family. A number that sounds generous until you consider that a family eating wild-caught fish as a primary protein source goes through significantly more than that across 12 months. The Kenai was managed for recreational fishing traffic, for sport hunters, for tourism. The rules reflected that. In the eastern interior, near Wrangell St. Elias, the rules are entirely different. Dennis put a number on it plainly. Up here, they are allowed to harvest 500 sockeye salmon per year. That's not a typo. The difference between 45 and 500 is the difference between supplementing your diet and actually feeding your family from the land. Hunting quotas are similarly expanded. Their season opens earlier. The permitted species list is broader: moose, elk, deer, porcupine, bear. The legal framework around their new location was specifically designed to allow people in that zone to do exactly what they came to do: live off the land. Dennis said it directly. That was a big factor. The goal, the dream, was to genuinely live off the land. And at Wrangell St. Elias, they finally could. Here's what the comments kept asking, and here's the answer they never got, until now. The YouTube channel was not the plan. It was the consequence of the plan. When the Westerlinds moved to their new homestead near Slana in spring 2024, the change in their circumstances was significant. Back on the Kenai, they had supplemented their homesteading income by working in the local real estate market. Amy had continued her herbalism work. Before that, in Maine, Dennis had farmed and done odd jobs while Amy built her practice. The Westerlinds had always found a way to generate income through the land or the skills it had given them. At Wrangell St. Elias, that equation shifted. The location was too remote for side work. The cabin was too small, and the homestead too new for anything but full-time attention. So they started filming. One GoPro, no professional gear, no production team, just 2 people documenting what they were doing anyway and deciding that other people might want to watch. They named the channel Holdfast Alaska, a name that carries its own meaning, a nautical term for something that grips and holds fast against force, and published their first videos in September 2024. What they built was deliberately different from most homesteading content on YouTube. Dennis and Amy made a conscious decision not to focus on the things that typically define the genre. Garden tours, livestock updates, harvest tallies, those have their place, but that wasn't the story they wanted to tell. Their story was the subsistence lifestyle in its rawest form. A 17-hour round-trip supply run to Anchorage, because that's what it takes when you live where they live. Building an A-frame chicken coop with a living roof, packed with insulation material grown directly on top of the structure, because the winters in that part of Alaska demand it. Hunting moose and porcupine, not as sport, but as dinner, and showing what that process actually looks like from field to table. Amy teaching the camera how to can, how to forage, how to use wild plants as medicine, how to lacto-ferment food for preservation without electricity. What Dennis said about the response surprised even him. In under a year, the channel hit 52,000 subscribers. He hadn't expected that number. Neither had Amy. The community that gathered around Holdfast Alaska wasn't just people who lived off the grid. It was people who never would, but who wanted to understand what it actually looked like for someone who did. And if you think that was surprising, stay with me, because this next part is why the whole story matters. 52,000 subscribers in under a year was already far beyond what Dennis and Amy expected. But that number didn't hold still. As of mid-2026, the Holdfast Alaska channel has grown past 216,000 subscribers and accumulated more than 32 million views. For a channel that launched with a GoPro in September 2024, built around the daily realities of subsistence living in one of North America's most remote corners, those numbers represent something significant. Not just in terms of growth rate, though the rate itself is notable, but in terms of what the audience is actually responding to. This is not a channel built on dramatic personal revelation, controversy, or the kind of manufactured tension that drives most viral content. The Westerlinds do not argue on camera. There are no cliffhanger episodes about whether the relationship will survive the wilderness. What they offer instead is something rarer on YouTube. Unscripted competence, Dennis building something, Amy preserving something. Both of them moving through a day that has real stakes and real physical consequences. The channel also runs a membership program, a separate tier for viewers who want access to content that doesn't go to the general public. This is not unusual for channels of this size, but it signals something worth noting. The Westerlinds have built an audience loyal enough to pay for continued access, not just subscribe for free. That membership income, layered on top of standard YouTube ad revenue, is how a channel built in one of America's most isolated zip codes becomes a sustainable business. What Amy said about the channel's purpose is the part that explains its longevity. She wanted it to be somewhere that people could genuinely learn, not just watch. To teach canning, to teach foraging, to make herbal medicine accessible to people who might never step foot in a wilderness but wanted to understand how it worked. And alongside that, to inspire. Because inspiration, she said, was what got them started in the first place. A book, an idea, a feeling that the life they were living was a smaller version of the one they were capable of living. That framing matters for understanding what comes next. And that's when the decision was made. The one nobody around them saw coming. Dennis and Alaska bis hining fear. And it came not through a formal announcement, but through a video that showed exactly what Dennis had been quietly working on. The cabin they purchased in 2024 was small. That was always the reality of it. A functional, off-grid log structure on 7 acres of interior Alaska, everything they needed to survive, and not much else. For a family of 3 operating a full homestead in one of the country's most demanding environments, the constraints of a small cabin become apparent quickly. There isn't room for the tools, the preserved food stores, the firewood, the equipment, and also a family living a full daily life inside the same 4 walls. In November 2025, Dennis started building. He began adding windows to the screen room attached to the cabin, a critical first step in converting that additional space into something usable through an Alaskan winter. Foundation repairs came alongside that work, addressing the structural groundwork needed before any expansion could go further. The video documenting this process, captioned as 24 hours on their remote Alaska homestead, gave the audience its clearest look yet at where the physical homestead is headed. This is what Dennis has confirmed about what's next for Holdfast Alaska. They are not leaving. They are not downsizing. They are not pivoting the channel towards something more produced or more polished. They are expanding. The cabin grows. The homestead grows. The skills documented on camera grow. The direction of travel is deeper into the life they chose, not away from it. That posture is worth taking seriously. Because the Westerlinds have made the decision to leave before, Maine to Alaska, Kenai Peninsula to Wrangell St. Elias interior, every move they have made has been away from comfort and towards something harder, wilder, and more demanding. The decision to stay, to build onto the current cabin rather than move again, signals something. It signals that they have found the place, not a temporary stopping point, the place. What also remains consistent is the channel itself. The Westerlinds continue to publish content at a steady rate from their Slaina homestead. Amy's food content, the moose chili, the sourdough, the lacto-fermented preserves, the salmon preservation done the traditional way, using sun, smoke, and wind, rather than refrigeration, continues to be a central pillar of what the channel produces. Dennis's builds, repairs, and subsistence hunting work anchor the other half. Together, they cover a full picture of what genuine subsistence living looks like, not curated, not filtered. One phone call, one conversation. That's all it took to change the direction of everything. And in this case, what changed was the scope of what they were willing to build. There is a detail in this story that gets overlooked in most coverage of Holdfast Alaska, and it is the one that most clearly explains how this channel grew to the size it did in the time it did. Dennis and Amy Westerlind did not grow up with any of the skills they now demonstrate to more than 216,000 people. Neither one came from a farming family. Neither had any background in off-grid construction, animal husbandry, hunting, food preservation, or wilderness medicine. They came from densely populated suburban towns in New England. Amy grew up in the same kind of neighborhood, where most of their audience grew up. Dennis spent his early adult years on a lobster boat, which gave him a certain toughness, a tolerance for physical difficulty, and an understanding of weather, but did not prepare him for building log cabins or running a subsistence household in one of the most isolated regions of North America. What they have demonstrated across 15 years of building, moving, failing, and rebuilding is that the skills required to live the way they live are learned, not inherited. That is the message underneath all of the content. The tomatoes on the apartment patio in Massachusetts. The first tent pitched on raw Maine land they'd never farmed. The ferry crossing through 36-foot seas to a state they'd never visited. Each step was taken by two people who did not know how to do what they were about to do, and who did it anyway. That sequence, the one that runs from Massachusetts to Maine, to Kenai, to Wrangell, St. Elias, is not a story about people who were built for this life. It is a story about two people who chose it, and then chose it again, and then chose it again. And each time they chose it, the stakes were higher, the location was more remote, and the margin for error was smaller. The response to that story, 32 million views, 216,000 subscribers, a paying membership community, a feature in national publications, is not really about homesteading content. It is about people who changed their lives completely, on purpose, more than once, and are now living proof that the thing they wanted was achievable. The cabin expansion Dennis confirmed in late 2025 is the latest chapter, not the final one. This is a story about two people from the suburbs who looked at the life they were supposed to want and decided it wasn't going to be enough, and then spent the next 15 years building something most people would never attempt. What's next for Holdfast Alaska, as Dennis has now confirmed through both his words and his work, is more of what they came to Wrangell, St. Elias to do. A bigger cabin, a more capable homestead, a deeper subsistence life, and a channel that continues to show it all. The expansion happening on that 7-acre property near Slana is not a renovation project. It is a statement. They are putting down permanent roots in the most remote homestead they've ever lived on, in the most demanding environment they've ever chosen. And they are inviting an audience of more than 216,000 people to watch every step of it. If you've followed Dennis and Amy from the beginning, or if you're just discovering what they've built, the question worth sitting with is this: do you think most people who talk about wanting a different life would actually have followed through with every move the Westerlinds made? Or is this the kind of story that only works because they refused to stop when every rational voice around them said it was time?